Fighting to protect their ancestors, a Valley family says a plan to build a levee wall would disrupt what is supposed to be a final resting place. Channel 5's Trayson Bragg reports.
That family's history in the Valley dates back to the 1800s. It was a time when the practice of owning slaves was legal in this country. We learned the remains that lay in the family's cemetery are those of heroes. Headstones, historical markers, and the first Spanish Protestant church in the Valley sit on what was once the Jackson Ranch.
We have our Easter here every year, and the children will play.
Ramiro Ramirez tells us his great-great-great-grandfather founded this property in the early 1850s. The headstones that surround him make up the burial site of generations of his family. It's a sense of pride for the family. Ramirez and his wife already selected their plots here as well.
And I was throwing a fit. I was like 6 years old, and I told my father I was going to die, and I wanted to know where I was going to be buried. And my mother yelled out, "Tú sabes dónde vas a estar. Tú estás allá en el capote. No andas preguntando."
Ramirez says where he will be buried is in question. Last year, he and his family learned the federal government plans to build a wall along the levee that sits directly behind the cemetery. In those plans, CBP has designed a 150-foot zone south of the levee they say is needed to build an access road. That will force Ramirez and his family to move their ancestors.
You don't do that. You just don't do that.
We wanted to learn more about the people buried in Ramirez's family cemetery. We headed to the Museum of South Texas History. There we learned his great-great-great-grandfather, Nathaniel Jackson, a white man, married a black woman in Alabama. To escape persecution, they set a course for Mexico. They settled just north of the border.
They could essentially live here in peace and set up their ranch without being harassed, more essentially.
Senior historian Tom Fort says Jackson and his wife brought 10 former slaves with them on their journey to freedom. Shortly after establishing their ranch, the couple decided to play a part in freeing a countless number of former slaves.
Almost, you might say, the last stop before the river on a relatively unknown aspect of the Underground Railroad as it became known up in the upper South and the northern states.
It was an action Ford says could have led to arrest or even death had the Confederate soldiers stationed in the valley been aware. That's history, Ramirez says, could be lost and dishonored if the wall is built on the site. He tells us he and his family intend to fight construction as long as they can.
My grandson one day will be ringing that bell. One day he'll be tall enough to walk on the steps of his great-great-great-grandfather.
Ramirez adds that bell is the original bell placed on the property. The bell all of his ancestors rang before him and may not be able to ring after. Channel 5 plans to follow the family's fight. In the studio, Trayson Bragg, Channel 5 News at 10.